dawn here this morning of April 12th, 1861, the long night of waiting is over. In a few minutes, we'll know if the United States is to be divided into two independent nations split by civil war. Major Robert Anderson, commander of Fort Sumter, is about ready to give his reply to the Confederate demand that he surrender this northern fortress in the heart of the seceded South. If Major Anderson does name a surrender date, that will be a sign the federal government is unable to maintain its authority in the slavery states. But if he refuses to yield Sumter, that will be a challenge to the concept of states' rights under which the Confederacy has been formed. The Confederate guns may then open fire on this fort, an act that would probably be the signal for civil war between the North and the South. The officers gathered here in the guardroom at Fort Sumter have received no advance indication as to what Major Anderson will do. Some
April 12, 1861, Charleston, South Carolina. You are there.
States' rights or federal sovereignty? The North and the South confront each other at Fort Sumter. Will there be peace at the cost of union or civil war? CBS takes you back 88 years to the great crisis of the American Republic. All things are as they were then, except for one thing. When CBS is there,
you are there.
You Are There, produced and directed by Robert Louis Cheon, is based on authentic historical fact and quotation. And now,
Charleston, the guardroom at Fort Sumter, and Don Hollenbeck.
Out into civil war. There are about 15 officers and men here in the bare, gloomy, candlelit guardroom at Fort Sumter, a room sparsely furnished. It's about 25 feet long with a low vaulted ceiling. It's been a sleepless night. The Confederate delegation, headed by Colonel James Chestnut, arrived about 1 o'clock this morning, delivered the Southern ultimatum to Major Anderson, commander of the fort. That ultimatum demands that Major Anderson name the day when he'll surrender Fort Sumter. It implies that force will be used if the major refuses to yield. Major Anderson and his staff went immediately into conference. They've been in the major's office these past 3 hours framing an answer. A moment ago, the major sent word by his orderly that he's about ready to reply, and we're waiting for him to appear. The 3 members of the Confederate delegation are sitting at the guardroom table with Colonel Chestnut, the head of the delegation. There are Captain Stephen D. Lee, Lieutenant Colonel A.R. Chisholm, and one civilian, Congressman Roger Pryor of Virginia. The Southerners seem calm, confident, but the men of this federal garrison, on the other hand, are nervous and tense. They're running low on provisions. They've been almost blockaded for 3 weeks. Ever since the election of Abraham Lincoln last November on an anti-slavery platform, his election, of course, has brought this crisis between the North and South to a head. While Major Anderson's just come into the guardroom, he's walking toward the Southern delegation at the table. Major Anderson's 56, tall, graduate of West Point, fought with distinction in the Indian and Mexican wars. The major's from Kentucky. He's a slave owner himself, yet his sympathies are certain to be pro-union. Now Major Anderson has stopped at the table. Now he's facing Colonel Chestnut, the head of the Southern delegation.
Colonel.
Major Anderson is speaking.
Forgive me for keeping you waiting so long. Important decisions are not made easily.
We appreciate that, sir.
Colonel, as I informed you earlier, Fort Sumter's food supplies are exhausted. Unless we receive provisions, we shall be starved out in 3 days. Please inform your government that I shall surrender Fort Sumter 3 days from now, on the 15th of April, unless, prior to that date, I receive new instructions from my government at Washington for additional provisions.
In other words, you refuse to surrender.
I just told you, Colonel. I will evacuate this fort on the 15th, unless...
That won't do, Major Anderson. My government will not accept a qualified answer. We know as well as you that Mr. Lincoln has dispatched a fleet to bring you provisions, and that fleet should arrive here sometime today. We want a hard and fast answer, no ifs or buts. You want your word that you will surrender this fort at once, immediately.
I can't do that, Colonel Chestnut. It'd be a violation of my honor. I have an obligation to the government of the United States.
Major Anderson, you as a Southern owe a sacred obligation to the people of the South.
I am an officer of the United States Army.
Sir, I have authority of Brigadier General Beauregard, commanding the provisional forces of the Confederate States of America, I have the honor to inform you that as soon as I reach our guns to give the command, we will open the fire of our batteries on Fort Sumter. Good day, sir.
Colonel Chestnut and Major Anderson exchange salutes. Colonel Chestnut and his party are leaving the guardroom now. It will take them some little time to row across the harbor to the nearest Confederate guns. Now Major Anderson has turned to talk to several officers who've gathered around him. As soon as he's finished, we'll try to get a word with him. The Major looks pale. There's an expression of great sadness on his face. He's been pushed into this situation. As we said, Major Anderson is from Kentucky, probably torn by conflicting loyalties to the South and to the federal government. The Major stopped talking to his officers. Major Anderson, sir, may we have a word with you, please?
Well, only a moment. I'm very busy.
I understand, sir. Major, do you think Colonel Chestnut will make good that threat to fire on you?
I hope not, sir. But if he does, we shall answer fire with fire.
Well, if the bombardment does take place, how long do you think you can hold out?
If a bombardment takes place, the fate of Fort Sumter won't matter. We shall then be concerned with civil war. With the fate of our country, sir.
Thank you very much, Major Anderson. The Major's leaving the guardroom. The other federal officers and soldiers are talking quietly now. Nothing they can do but wait. And now for some comments on Major Anderson's reply to Colonel Chestnut. We take you to our studios in Washington and Quincy Howe.
We've just heard Colonel Chestnut threaten to fire on Sumter without first consulting his government. That's the Confederate government at Montgomery, Alabama. That's strange. You'd really think in such a crisis as this, Colonel Chestnut would have telegraphed Major Anderson's reply to his superiors in Montgomery. Then Confederate President Jefferson Davis would have had to make the decision whether or not to wait for Fort Sumter to surrender on the 15th of April. But apparently Colonel Chestnut just didn't do that. He pointed out that a federal provision fleet is steaming toward Sumter, and he threatened to open fire on the fort in a few minutes. Of course, it may well be that the colonel is just bluffing, hoping the threat will cause Major Anderson to surrender right away, before the food ships arrive, that is. Major Anderson still has time to indicate surrender. He can raise a white flag or lower the stars and stripes from Fort Sumter's mast. If Major Anderson does not surrender, and if Colonel Chestnut means what he says, the decision on peace or war lies with President Abraham Lincoln right here in Washington. The president can still, of course, telegraph Major Anderson instructions to surrender Fort Sumter. That would avoid an armed conflict between the North and the South. I've just been informed that President Lincoln is about to speak to reporters at the White House. Doug Edwards is there. So we take you now to the White House, and go ahead, Doug Edwards.
The doors to the president's sitting room have just been opened, and correspondents from every section of the country, including the South, are entering. President Lincoln is sitting at the desk. With Mr. Lincoln are his personal secretary, Mr. Hay, and the Secretary of State, Mr. Seward. Mr. Lincoln shows the strain of waiting for telegraph bulletins from the fort. He looks very tired. His face is drawn. His shoulders are bent, and his black coat is wrinkled. The sitting room door has just been shut. The next voice you hear will be that of President Abraham Lincoln.
Gentlemen, you know by now that the guns of the Confederacy threatened to open fire on Fort Sumter. The senior officer of the fort, Major Anderson, has refused to surrender unless he receives instructions to do so from me. The country has a right to know where I stand on this question. My position was made clear in my inaugural address. At that time, I said, acts of violence within any state against the authority of the United States are revolutionary. I said further, the Constitution expressly enjoins upon me that the laws of the Union be faithfully executed in all the states. I said the power confided in me will be used to hold, occupy, and possess the places and property of the government. And that includes Fort Sumter. Now, gentlemen, I shall be glad to answer your questions to the best of my ability.
Mr. President, does that mean you won't order Fort Sumter to surrender?
Please, one at a time.
Mr. President, I represent the Charleston Mercury. Do your remarks mean that you will not order Major Anderson to surrender Fort Sumter?
We may not think the same way about the Constitution in Charleston as we do in Springfield, but I think we speak the same brand of English.
Speaking is easy, Mr. President, but will you fight for Fort Sumter?
I do not anticipate bloodshed.
Mr. President, is it your opinion that the Confederate threat to fire on Fort Sumter is only a bluff?
I don't know. But if the threat is in earnest, I trust that saner men will not permit it to be carried out. I trust that the leaders of the South will prevail on the officers at Charleston not to plunge the nation into civil war.
Mr. President, the people of the South feel that your party is forcing a civil war by its stand on the issue of slavery. What about that, Mr. President?
The issue before the country is not slavery. I have said time and again that I have no intention of interfering with the institution of slavery in the states where it now exists. The issue is the continuation of the Union.
But on that point, Mr. President, Southern statesmen argue that nothing in the Constitution binds any state to remain in the Union.
Southern statesmen are trying to make the states' rights tail wag the Union dog. In my opinion, the Union is supreme. No combination of states can get out of the Union on their own motion. Resolutions to that effect are illegal.
Nevertheless, Mr. President, 6 Southern states have seceded. They claim Fort Sumter is Confederate property. Now, will you go to war to hold that property for the North?
Not for the North, sir, but for the Union, under the Constitution of the United States. When I took the oath of office as president, I pledged myself to defend and preserve the Constitution. The Constitution will not be defended and preserved unless it is enforced and obeyed in every part of every one of the United States. And that includes Charleston, South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. President. President Lincoln has risen, indicating that the news conference is over. The correspondents are filing out. As you heard, no new orders will be telegraphed to Major Anderson at Fort Sumter. There may be civil war in a matter of minutes, unless the Confederate officers at Charleston are bluffing or are overruled by the Confederate government. Ken Roberts has been standing by at the executive mansion of President Jefferson Davis in Montgomery, Alabama, and he may have some news on that. We switch you now to the seat of the Confederate government in Montgomery, Alabama. Ken Roberts reporting.
President Jefferson Davis of the Confederate States of America will be with us in a moment. Right now, the President of the Southern Confederacy is in the office adjoining his anteroom speaking to members of his cabinet. The cabinet members hurried to the executive mansion when the latest report from Fort Sumter came over the telegraph wires a few minutes ago. Mr. Davis, as you probably know, is a former United States Senator, a general of the Mississippi Militia, and served as United States Secretary of War under President Pierce. Mr. Davis has entered this anteroom. The door has been closed. Mr. President, are you going to order Colonel Chestnut not to fire on Fort Sumter?
The authority to deal with the situation at Fort Sumter has been delegated to General Beauregard. It seems that General Beauregard has in turn delegated the authority to Colonel Chestnut.
Well, President Davis, as Commander-in-Chief of the Confederate forces, you can still intervene, can't you?
I have no desire to intervene.
The commander of Fort Sumter, Major Anderson, has agreed to surrender the fort in 3 days.
Would you consider waiting 3 days before bombarding Sumter on the possibility that war might be avoided?
The fate of Fort Sumter, sir, will be settled at the Charleston level.
But if the colonel does open fire, won't the Confederacy stand responsible for having started a civil war?
If war breaks out, the responsibility will rest squarely on the shoulders of Abraham Lincoln. He has refused to recognize the sovereignty of the individual states. Mr. Lincoln has leveled a gun at the heart of the South. We cannot wait only for the sake of having him fire the first gun.
You feel then, Mr. Davis, that war between the United States and the Confederate States is inevitable?
Sir, we sent commissioners to Washington hoping to negotiate a peaceful withdrawal from the Union. They were scorned. Mr. Lincoln promised to withdraw his garrison from Fort Sumter. The promise was broken, as all Mr. Lincoln's promises have been broken. Mr. Lincoln will not permit a peaceful separation of the North and South. He prefers civil war to dissolution of the Union. And so he has created this situation at Fort Sumter as a war challenge to the Confederate States of America. The South, sir, cannot avoid that challenge with honor.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson Davis. The President of the Confederacy is rejoining the members of his cabinet in the other room. As you heard, it's up to Colonel James Chestnut in Charleston to decide whether or not Fort Sumter will be bombarded today. John Daly at Fort Johnson in Charleston Harbor reports that the Colonel's boat is rowing across the harbor toward those Confederate guns. Go ahead, John Daly.
Here at Fort Johnson, and in the gray light of the dawn, we can see his oarsmen pulling steadily in this direction on their trip from the fort here to the battery. The stars and stripes are still flying over Sumter. If the bombardment of the fort is to take place, the signal gun will be fired from this mortar battery at Fort Johnson. The shot will be the signal for all the other batteries in the harbor to open fire on the fort. Sumter, you know, is in the center of the harbor, about 2,000 yards away. It's literally surrounded by the Confederate batteries. There's one to our right at Jane Island. Beyond that, still another battery at Cummings Point. The Morris Island guns. Across the harbor to my left are the Mount Pleasant guns, and to the right of them, the Fort Moultrie and Sullivan Island batteries. Hundreds of civilians of Charleston are lining the promenade at the battery, Charleston's waterfront. Others are on the city rooftop overlooking the harbor, and the streets have been gay and bright with the young ladies' gowns, young ladies who are charmed with their dashing cavaliers. Many of the ladies, by the way, have been busy already preparing comfort for the soldiers of the Confederacy. There is some sense of alarm among small segments of the population who seem to know what war may be like, but in the main, Charleston has had a great gala fete out of this preparation for the bombardment or non-bombardment of Fort Sumter. A crowd of several hundred excited civilians has gathered here at Fort Johnson, and here too is the Charleston Firemen's Band, which you've just heard. All Charleston has been making the Sumter affair a really gala event, and the band is here to see it through in complete style. With us is Captain George F. James, the Confederate officer in charge of these guns here at the fort, and Captain James, I should say, is about 30 years old. He wears the gray and blue uniform of the Palmetto Guard, a local unit of the South Carolina militia. Captain James tells me that he was an officer in the United States Army, but resigned his commission and joined the Army of the Confederate States 2 months ago. Captain James, as a former United States officer, how do you feel about firing on the United States flag?
I'm a West Pointer. I served under that flag. Some of those men at Sumter are my very good friends and fellow officers. If I have to fire on the Stars and Stripes, sir, it'll be the most difficult thing I ever expect to do.
Well, do you think that Colonel Chestnut will give the command to open fire?
Yes, sir, I think he will.
Even though it will mean civil war?
Even though it will mean civil war, yes, sir. Oh, we didn't want this, sir, but the North forced us into it.
Well, how so, Captain James?
Well, the North intends to take away our property.
Your property?
They put an anti-slavery president into the White House, didn't they?
Oh, I see. By property, you mean slaves.
Certainly I do mean slaves. I have 179 blacks on my plantation. Now, how long do you think I'll keep those slaves with Abe Lincoln running the country?
Well, hasn't Mr. Lincoln promised not to interfere with slavery in the states where it now exists? He said only that he is against extending slavery to the new Western territories.
That's what he said. But we Southerners know what he's after. First, he wants to stop white men from holding slave property in the Western territories. Then, when the territories come into the Union, they'll come in as free states, anti-slavery states. That'll give the abolitionists enough votes in Congress to abolish slavery right here in the South. Southern slave property is worth $400 million. That's a mighty big investment. And it won't be safe until the South is recognized as an independent slave-holding nation.
Thank you, Captain James.
Thank you, sir.
Colonel Chestnut's boat has just reached the Fort Johnson landing below us here. He should be here shortly. And the Charleston Firemen's Band has just struck up Dixie, the new minstrel song which has been sweeping the South. The crowd is joining in, singing the words rather defiantly. Let's listen. Dixie, the new minstrel song by Dan Emmett, which is fast becoming something like a national anthem for the Confederacy. As you can hear, the band has already heightened the spirits of the gay crowd which has gathered here and been here for so many hours, waiting to see how this question is going to be resolved on the Charleston waterfront. The young ladies, again, are taking a leading part in the almost celebration that is continuous here along the battery of Charleston and even here in the confines of the fort. The young ladies' bright and gay dresses and their high voices make a steady pattern of sound. While we were listening to the music, by the way, we noticed Judge James Pettigrew in the crowd, and the judge has agreed to an interview. He's here with us now. Judge Pettigrew is the leader of the pro-union men of South Carolina, one of the few pro-unionists in Charleston to escape being thrown into jail for expressing his views. The judge, a man of 72, has the respect of even his most violent political opponents, not only because of his advanced years and his service to the South, but also because he is universally recognized as the greatest legal authority in the United States. Judge Pettigrew, in your opinion, Judge, Colonel Chestnut and his party have just entered the fort. The four men are walking this way toward Captain James, who stands near the signal gun. And by the way, I'm told that the gun is already loaded and aimed, ready to fire on Fort Sumter if and when Colonel Chestnut gives the word. As he approaches now, Colonel Chestnut is talking to Congressman Pryor of Virginia. The congressman, as you know, is an ardent supporter of secession, famous for his denunciations of the abolitionists, and a leader of the movement to take the state of Virginia out of the Union. Last night in Charleston, the congressman told a cheering crowd that if South Carolina strikes the blow, fires on Fort Sumter, Virginia will secede, and now Colonel Chestnut is speaking. Captain James, we are going to fire on Fort Sumter.
Yes, sir.
Congressman Pryor, will you... Wait, gentlemen, wait. Colonel Chestnut, I warn you, if you fire that gun, you'll start a blaze that'll consume the South in everlasting flame. Judge Pettigrew, I have the authorization of General Beauregard. Authorization? Beauregard? You men realize what you're doing. Judge Pettigrew, if you speak.
Congressman Pryor has interrupted.
Judge Pettigrew, I respect your gray hair and your reputation. Yet I must warn you, sir, true sons of the South will not stand by much longer and allow a traitor in their midst.
Congressman, men like you are provoking a war which the South cannot win. If you fire that gun, you will thrust the South into war against the most powerful people on earth. In the name of heaven, think before you take
passion that'll slam the door on any hope of peace. Sir, you speak eloquently about peace. But what about honor, sir? Would you have peace without honor? You say we cannot win a war against the North, and I tell you we'll trample them in the dust. Fire that gun, and millions of loyal Southerners will flock to the banners. Virginia will secede. The border slave states will follow Virginia into the Confederacy. Weapons will come from England and France. I say annihilate this union, stinted with corruption and tyranny. Fire the gun, and as surely as the morning sun rises, we will create on Southern soil a new nation, which will be the glory and envy of the world.
The crowd is backing Congressman Pryor. They're crying out, fire the gun, give the signal for bombardment. Judge Pettigrew has thrown up his arms in a gesture of despair, of helplessness. He's walking away, shaking his head sadly, but the crowd ignores him. They're still calling for the firing of the gun. Colonel Chester is raising his arms for silence, shouting for the people to give him their attention, and the crowd is responding. Now, Colonel Chester.
Ladies and gentlemen, there is one man who most deserves the great privilege of firing the first gun on Fort Sumter. I refer, of course, to the distinguished congressman from Virginia, Mr. Pryor. Sir, you accept the honor. I thank you, but I cannot fire the first shot of civil war.
Congressman Pryor, the most ardent advocate of war in the South, has refused to fire the first gun. The crowd is silent. It seems to be stunned. They don't know what to do, and it may be that even at this last moment... Colonel Chestnut again.
Captain James, fire the signal gun.
Captain James hesitates, but he is walking quickly to the signal gun.
Now he's pulled the lanyard. The signal gun has been fired. The shell is mounting high into the air. We can follow it by the glare of its fuse, and it's dropping over Fort Sumter. It's going to hit inside the fort. Now the Cummings Point battery to my right has opened fire on the port deck of the Moultrie batteries. The Sullivan Island guns are now across the harbor. To my left, the guns on Mount Pleasant. The bombardment of Fort Sumter has begun, and it means war between the United States and the Confederate States of America. Civil war. Here in Charleston Harbor, the war begins. Suddenly, these people here seem to have become aware of the tremendous and tragic implications. They're silent.
Charleston, South Carolina, April 12, 1861. The South fires on Fort Sumter, and the Civil War begins.
You have been listening to April 12th, 1861, Fort Sumter. Another broadcast in the series You Are There, produced and directed by Robert Louis Cheon. Fort Sumter was written by Michael Sklar. The cast included Matt Crowley, Stotts Cotsworth, Guy Arbery, Bernard Lenrow, Chester Stratton, Edwin Jerome, James Monks, Scott Tennyson, Robert Cromwell, Guy Sorrell, and others. Station WSCC, Columbia's affiliate in Charleston, South Carolina, assisted in the research for this broadcast. Next week,
October 3rd, 1574, Holland, the siege of Leiden. You are there.
what makes a congressman? What are the moving forces behind the man or the woman who represents you in Congress? How well do they translate your views into yeas or nays? What are the pressures, the compromises, the contradictions that confront a freshman congressman when he reaches Washington? Tonight, the famous star of radio, stage, and screen, Mr. Ralph Bellamy, will come to CBS to play a freshman congressman in the CBS documentary unit's latest broadcast, The People's Choice. The People's Choice is based on 6 months of research, study, and interviews with members of Congress, Washington experts, and with voters like yourselves. Don't miss The People's Choice, starring Ralph Bellamy, tonight on most of these same CBS network stations. This is CBS, where 99 million people gather every week, the Columbia Broadcasting System.